Hello, everybody. Hope you're all safe and sound. So, this should be the lecture following the lecture by Sarah on the trust game. And this is an application, a paper actually, that is applying the trust game to tackle a research question. And I think I already told you about it in the brainstorming session that we had before teaching was suspended. So this is joint work between me and Rebecca Morton at New York University, um, and an amended version of this paper was published recently in Electoral Studies, and I think I uploaded that paper on Moodle where we expand on the Egypt experiment and also do some experiments at New York University, and we managed to publish it. But I'm going just to focus on the Egypt experiment, applying the trust game to tackle a research question. Again, for all of you to know how to know about basically an example of how a research, an experimental research is designed, a theory is developed, a motivation is outlined. Because many of you still ask too many questions about the theory, what should be written in the theory. So I hope this presentation would then clarify. So the title of the paper is Negative Campaigning أو الدعاية السلبية, or actually what we mean by negative campaigning here is attacks between politicians, harsh attacks between politicians, and interpersonal trust. Interpersonal trust is basically trust between individuals. الثقة بين الأفراد. Okay, so I'll now move to the next slide. So it is always, it's more of customary right now to start your paper with an overview of the results. I know we're not used to this at FEPS, but basically this is now how papers are being written. Not now, but usually. In the sense, we're always taught at FEPS to not to outline the results at the very beginning, but no, the introduction should give in maybe a couple of pages an overview of your whole study. So the motivation, the question, the theory, the design, and the results. And the aim basically is, well, first of all, if no one wants to continue reading the paper, he or she will grasp the whole idea. If he or she wants to continue reading the paper, you basically lock them in and you make sure that they know the way you're taking or the journey you're taking them along, and they know whether the paper is interesting to be read actually or not, and what's in it for them. So it's again just to make readers focused and not to get distracted. I recommend you that in the introductions you basically sum up the whole paper, including the results. Well, you will not have results because you will not actually do data collection as we've agreed last time, but sum up the motivation, the theory, question, and the experimental design. So, for example, just for you to follow, the objective of the paper basically is to test the effect of negative campaigning, again by this we mean attacks between politicians, on trust among citizens. So we assume that when politicians attack each other, citizens' trust decrease not only in politicians but actually between citizens among themselves, which for some is a bit far-fetched, but we think we have the theory to back this up. And what we prove is that there is such a significant effect because subjects in the experiment whom we have exposed to an environment of negative campaigning, where statistically or exhibited uh, statistically significant lower levels of interpersonal trust among each other, and also because we sort of manipulated an environment or a context of elections. They also were less likely to vote, so they had a lower propensity to vote than those who were not exposed to a context of negative campaigning in a hypothetical election. So you know the results now. I'll show you basically how we design an experiment to um, test this hypothesis and eventually get this result. So the motivation for the paper, this was an experiment done in 2014. Well, all of you were young, actually, maybe still at school back then. But at that time, and I would say from 2011 till 2014 at least, or I would say till 2013, 14, yes. Egypt has seen, I mean, with the 2011 uprising, Egypt has really seen, and given the media freedoms, the sudden media freedoms, Egypt has seen a huge increase in negative attacks between politicians, which was something new to Egypt compared with the previous decades, where, of course, you could say, well, media freedoms um, were not without a ceiling, as they were after 2000, between 2000, after the 2011 uprising. So, and again, this is part of a larger project where we study basically some of the negative consequences or dark sides of transitions or chaotic transitions as the ones we've seen in Egypt in 2011 and 12. So we have seen this increase in negative campaigning, and then there were many common attacks using very, well, I would say indecent language, um, liberals, Islamists, conservatives, nationalists attacking each other, and even personally attacking each other at an extent that Egyptians hardly seen before. So our motivation basically was, well, this is definitely or likely this will likely have societal consequences. It's not just going to be confined to politicians attacking each other, but the more people see this kind of attack um, in a context in which they were not accustomed to, and in which politicians are uh, tarnishing the images of one another, then this is likely to project an image that society overall is not to be trusted, compared to a context in which negative campaigning is not happening at that extent. So part of the motivation is, of course, that trust itself is a very, very important value. And there is a lot of literature, as you see, both in economics, political science, sociology, anthropology, etc., on the importance of having a reasonable level of interpersonal trust between individuals in a society. Otherwise, societies will suffer significant consequences. So, trust helps form social capital, civic engagement, and we know that social capital has its own independent effects on economic growth and democracy, on cooperation levels at times of crises, as we're seeing right now in the world. We know also that trust reduces the costs of exchange in daily market transactions. The example I've told you in the previous lecture with the lost luggage at the airport and passengers um, preferring to come and collect their lost luggage themselves instead of having them delivered to their homes out of fear that the drivers might look into the luggage and maybe steal some of their stuff. Trust also helps establishing stable political institutions. That's more or less an established fact. And again, I think we've tackled this before. Parties are built on political parties are built on trust. Companies are built on trust. Interest groups, lobbies, social movements. If you do not have a reasonable level of trust, all these very, very important institutions in the political development of any country do not get formed, or get formed but function in an ineffective way. And well, generally speaking, also there's much quantitative lecture that associates trust with economic growth and economic, political, and social success. So trust is quite central. It would be bad if a society has significantly low levels of trust. And we think that an increased level of negative campaigning might decrease that level of interpersonal trust. So this, as far as our dependent variable is concerned, trust. But as far as our independent variable is concerned, and this is the literature review, and I urge you all to do some bit of literature review in your papers. We're not really looking for an extended review, but and I mean, now literature reviews and published papers are getting smaller and smaller in size. But I just, maybe in a few paragraphs, I just want to make sure that you have read, and you should basically, by the literature review, convince us that you're more or less doing something new, and that you're on top of the literature, have read enough to say that no one before has really exactly examined the question you are answering. So when it comes to negative campaigning and trust, well, generally the literature on negative campaigning is mixed. Some see it as positive, some see it as negative. Some see it as positive in the sense that, well, if politicians keep attacking each other, this exposes them to the public, which increases the public knowledge about the different candidates, even the weaknesses of the different candidates, and helps the public make a more informed decision. So it's not an all negative thing. And on the other hand, of course, there are the negative consequences, that this decreases trust in politicians, maybe decreases trust in elections and democracy, and even the political system altogether. However, most of the literature that tackles negative campaigning is basically US based. So most of it tackles negative campaigning in the context of the United States, not even Europe. And it focuses on, the effect of negative campaigns on evaluation of candidates. So does the politician or candidate who campaigns more negatively is judged more favorably or less favorably? Is the target of that negative campaigning assessed as a victim, so more favorably or less favorably, etc.? And studies have also focused on the effect of negative campaigning on even trust in government. So if politicians are that bad or mean vis-a-vis each other, then I would then hardly trust government or politics altogether. As I've said, hardly any study on negative campaigning focused on transitional democracies, as Egypt at that time was. So we think we have a contribution as far as the topic is concerned, which is the effect of negative campaigning on interpersonal trust. And we think we also have a contribution as far as the case study is concerned, which is Egypt, not the US, not an old democracy. And we think generally, well, trust is a concept that is over-researched in the West, but it's very much under-researched in our region, in Arab societies and the Arab world. And we think that even by the time we did the experiment in 2014, there was probably only, I think 2 or 3 previous studies that measured trust in a lab as we did before us. So this is basically our main argument, or the theory. Again, many of you asked about what should we write in the theory. The theory should basically be your argument. In other words, you build the case for your hypothesis. Why do you want the reader to believe your story that uh, this independent variable affects that dependent variable. So you should talk about the mechanisms or the channels of influence from A to B. Uh, you should be more or less theoretically grounded in the sense that, well, because of this theory or that theory, etc., which are theories that have to be well cited. So just to give you an example, in this experiment, our theory was basically a negativity bias, which is basically the fact that, or not the fact, the observation that people give more weight to negative information than to positive information. So negative information sticks more and sticks for a long time. If you hear a bad story, you're more likely to remember that bad story maybe over a dinner conversation than all the other good stories that you have heard in the same time period. And this is mainly a psychological theory proven in social psychology. Um so you're more likely to remember that someone was insulted than if that same person was praised, for example. So that's our first theory, that negative attacks stick in the minds of people. And then there is also a priming effect. The priming effect is one of the very famous effects in social psychology. It basically means that um, just as written here, that a mental representation of a phenomenon affects behavior even outside the context of the phenomenon in which that mental representation was generated in the first place. So I might watch Fast and the Furious movies. I see drivers driving very fast, and then 1 hour later, I am driving my own car, although I'm driving it in Egypt, not in the US, and although it's not a sports car, although I'm not that very good driver, but I tend to drive faster compared to another day in which, or in which I do not actually watch Fast and Furious movies. So that's priming effect. Um, so we also think that, as far as our experiment is concerned, if politicians intentionally decrease trust in one another, then for ordinary people, this is carried over to reflect a societal or a society-wide situation in which all people are not to be trusted, not just politicians, because politicians are just people. So if I tend to distrust politicians because, or if I watch politicians attacking one another, distrusting one another, I'm more likely also to distrust fellow citizens. And the assumption again is that, well, priming effect assumes that you're not really rationalizing things, that you're not thinking very clearly because, well, if you're really rational, you might say, well, politicians are a different creed and they're just putting on a show, and I shouldn't really distrust Egyptians just because of the bad behavior I see from one politician vis-a-vis the other. But we know from, again, social psychology, and especially Kahneman, Tversky, that people have two mechanisms for making decisions. One is rational, but one is impulsive. And we think that impulsive meaning that you're less likely to use the usual power of your brain to assess a situation. And we think that when it comes to priming effect and negativity bias, this is the part of your judgment that you use, and eventually meaning that you're a little bit less rational when you apply the distrusting moods between politicians to the people. So our hypothesis is that negative campaigning sticks more strongly, or our main argument, sorry, it sticks more strongly, and trust behavior is impulsive. So here is the methodology then. As simple as it is, how do we test our hypothesis? We expose subjects to different or to contexts in which there are different levels of negative campaigning vis-a-vis positive campaigning and the control. And then after that exposure, we measure the trust level or the interpersonal trust level between them. If we find that those who are exposed to negative campaigns, to a context of negative campaigning, are less likely to trust each other compared to the control, then we prove our hypothesis. So it is very straightforward, very simple. We opt for a lab experiment. Again, because it introduces better control, we can make sure that all other background variables are constant with the exception just of the campaigning style and the usual um, arguments you need to use in order to convince the reader that an experiment, especially in our region, is more effective than a survey because you measure behavior. Trust is a subject of social conformity or social desirability, sorry, where people tend to not report completely honest answers. And that's why the world value survey questions, for example, about trust are not the best thing here. So we opt for the standard trust game. So here is the experimental design in detail. We had 4 different treatments so subjects were exposed to 4 different campaign environments. And we had a hypothetical scenario, which is that, and this was 2014, that there is a hypothetical election of the president of Cairo University Student Union. And we had subjects exposed to a situation in which the 2 candidates campaigning for that post, and we named them Alif wa B, A and B, started to negatively attack each other. So we had, as you can see below, we had a video in which a news anchor, مذيع يعني, tells the subjects that what candidate A and candidate B did today. And in the negative personality campaigning, both candidates basically attacked each other personally. So A started, B responded, and then A started again, B responded, etc., etc. And we picked or designed 3 styles of negative campaigning. One of them is forgery, that each one is basically attacking the other candidate of rigging a document. So one of them attacked the other one that he cheated in an exam. And then the other guy responded by attacking the first one, that he is claiming to have had a black belt in karate, whereas he did not. And then squandering public funds. One of them attacked the other, saying that he used to photocopy his campaign material using the photocopy machine in the library of the faculty. And the other one responded saying, I'm not sure I remember the attack now, but it also had to do with, yes, that he was previously in the student union of the university and he misused some of the funds. So we had matching accusations between A and B, and both attacked each other using basically the same subject. So this is the first treatment. The second treatment, we wanted to test whether if you attack a person, does it have a more negative effect on trust than if you attack the policy of that person. And therefore, the second treatment was basically the 2 candidates attacking the policy of each other, not the personality of each other, not the personal behavior of each other. So a candidate, and again, we chose 2 modes of attacks or 2 subjects of attacks. over-promising and flip-flopping. Over-promising, so candidate attack the other that he is actually promising to do things that are even against the rules and regulations of the university, so they will never be done. And then the other guy responded saying that, well, but you are also over promising to do things for which there are no funds. And then flip flopping is basically saying something and then being self contradictory. So uh, one said that the other guy is suggesting proposals that he used to reject before, etc., etc. And then the third treatment was positive campaigning. So no one is attacking each other, but both of them are uh, selling basically their campaign pledges. So saying something positive about their own policies. So this was basically candidate A saying that he will increase funding, he will get sponsors from outside the university to increase the funds for the student union. The other one saying that he will get a promise from the university president that the budget for the student union will be increased. And then on transparency and accountability, one said that he would regularly publish online the budget of the student union and all its decisions. Again, the other one said that, well, also I'm going to make it possible for students to withdraw confidence from me while I'm still in office, etc., etc. So this was the third one, and then the last one, of course, is the control, where they are shown a video of no political news. They are shown a video with the same news anchor saying a story about, again, and I think we talked about this before, um, a golf championship in Southeast Asia, and another story about a certain type of fish discovered off the coast of the UAE. In all of those treatments, we had videos of the same length to control for the length of the video and therefore the magnitude of the effect. It was the same news anchor dressed in the same white shirt that you could see with a very plain background, of course, the same background in all videos. In order to control for all these effects, because they're possibly their variation might introduce a noise to the experimental design. So this is the summary of the treatment. Again, it's very good just to put all the treatments in a table for the reader to follow. So we had a baseline. Again, as I've said, the video content is neutral discussions of non-political events. We had 2 sessions, 56 subjects, and as you can see, all the subjects were the same number in all treatments. Then the positive treatment, no attacks reported, but just positive messages about future pledges from each candidate. Again, same number of subjects. Negative personalities, so personality attacks. Negative policy, policy attacks. And after subjects watched this clip, all of them were asked to play the standard incentivized trust game with a partner, an anonymous partner, of course, in the same treatment. And it's the usual game where there is a player is given an endowment and then asked to send all, none, or some of that endowment to player B. And on the way, the amount gets doubled, and then player B could return all, some, or none of that amount to player A. What we're interested in is how many points does player A send to player B. So that's our measure of interpersonal trust. That's our dependent variable, our variable of interest. Of course, we also examine how much player B returns, which is trustworthiness, الجدارة بالثقة. But we do not largely find significant results there. Our main results are found in how many points or how much player A trusts player B, which is our main variable of interest anyhow right from the start. So this is our main finding. We do observe some statistically significant effects on trust levels in the negative personality treatment. So subjects that watched the video that reported party A and party B attacking the personality of each other, the money sent by player A or first movers to player B were 15% lower than the control. There were also effects in the negative policy treatment where that money was 9% lower than the control. There was absolutely no statistically significant effect for the positive treatment, which more or less we expected, but even though we had to run that treatment. So we find initial good support for our hypothesis, and this is just a graph comparing means, of course. So we're not, of course, just comparing means. You also in any paper have to do regressions, because then you could control for intervening variables. And as you could see, this is just a short version of the regression that we did, where we control for subjects' background variables like religion, gender. We also control for income, but it's not here. And we even control for the trust level as measured by the usual question, the world value survey question. And as you could see, the negative personality has the expected sign, which is negative, and it is statistically significant. So we had a robustness check. A robustness check is basically a certain question or a certain variable that tests that the mechanism by which your independent variable affects your dependent variable is the one you're arguing for. So in our design here, well, we thought if watching these videos affected trust via the mechanism of, say, that people saying, well, politicians are distrusting each other, then whole society should be distrusted, then they should also be distrusting politicians, the ones that are doing this negative campaigning, and they should be hesitant to take part in politics altogether. And therefore, we had a question for subjects asking them, well, if this hypothetical election was actually going to be held, how far would you be willing to vote in that election? To us, this was a measure of trust in the type of politics that is portrayed by these videos. And we did have a significant effect, and again, it more or less mirrors the significant effect that we have in trust. So the propensity to vote in that hypothetical election decreases in negative personality, as you could see, by 50% compared to the control, and also in the negative policy compared to the control. So the effects that we see on trust actually are working via the mechanisms that we argued that they will be working through, which again increases the trust in our results. Therefore, as a conclusion, this is just to wrap up, we think that, well, when politicians go negative, it is not just distrust in politics or distrust in them that ensues, but there are some wider negative repercussions that are triggered, and that negative campaigning has basically wider societal effects. So by this paper, or by this presentation, I wanted to show you again another example, a practical example of a paper that we did and eventually published with some variations on how to make use of a trust game to design a lab experiment. Again, in your papers, you would only stop at the experimental design. You will not go into the results because you will not actually be collecting any data, but make sure you have your motivation, research question, theory, and experimental design, more or less along the same lines that I have explained here. Again, if you have any questions, please email me. Some of you already did, and I usually try to dig for some articles relevant to your own research question. Best of luck and stay safe.